Sister with Discover Your Origins. In this video, I'm going to take a look at the 1860 U.S. Census. This is an important census because it was taken right before the American Civil War, and so you can kind of look at what happened to people over the next 10 years if you compare the families that existed in 1860 and then what they looked like in 1870. In certain areas of the country, especially the southern states, you can see the impact of the Civil War on American families. The census also captured a lot of economic information, such as occupations and property values and educational levels. So there's a lot of interesting things about the 1860 US Census. So first, let's go to the National Archives page. So this is the 8th census in 1790 that was taken. The census day was June 1st, 1860, and it was completed within about 5 months. If you want the specific instructions, there's a link here to the instructions to the marshals and assistants. The marshals were again responsible for actually administering and taking the counts. And this is also where the Secretary of the Interior and a superintendent of the census was assigned by Congress instead of the Secretary of State. So the questions that were asked were very similar to the 1850 US Census. You had a list of the houses and the families. They were numbered in order of visitation. Every person that was in the household was named. The age, sex, color, occupation, value of real estate, uh, place of birth, naming the state, territory, or country, married within the year, attended school, persons over 20 years of age who cannot read and write, and disability. There was a second schedule for slaves. Unfortunately, the only names recorded on the slave schedule was the name of the slave owner, and it listed the number of the slaves, the ages, sexes, color, whether they were fugitives, disabilities, etc. So even though there wasn't very much information recorded on the slave schedule, it can still be useful, especially if you're able to identify the slave owner. So here are some examples of what the 1860 U.S. Census looks like. And you can click on these images for some closer views, but there are also blank forms that you can use to transcribe information about your family. Nearly all of the states that existed at that time were included in the census. The slave schedules were only taken in selected states, the ones that had slavery. Although curiously, places like Utah and Texas, which were not necessarily slave states, did have slave schedules. There were several areas which were included with other areas. So parts of Nevada were included in Utah. Dakota Territory was in Nebraska Territory. And, again, West Virginia was part of Virginia. So there are a few areas that you need to be aware of that will not have their own unique census. There are some census records that are missing. Hernando County, Florida, there was no census taken. Bienville Parish, Louisiana is missing. And then there's about 4 counties of Mississippi that are missing. And it's possible that individual pages for other locations were also lost between storage and transportation. Of course, the census has been digitized and can be viewed on any of the major websites, genealogy websites. So I like to go to Wikipedia to look at the statistics for a census because it gives a really good snapshot. Like I said, the census for 1860 was important because it captures what the country looked like before the Civil War really started, but also because the country was starting to slip into the American Civil War, the tabulation and everything was collected, but the full statistical information wasn't released right away. And in fact, it proved to be a benefit to the northern side because it gave the North a lot of statistical information that they were able to use during the war, such as location of industry and what was the type of industry in various areas, the total population, the slave population, the agricultural products, transportation routes, all that kind of stuff became very valuable information to the North. The total population for the census increased about 35% to over 31 million people. The most populous state was New York, and the least populous was Oregon. And if you scroll down, you can see more statistics. Some of the occupational information that came out showed how many people were involved in farming or farm laborers. Um, there was an interesting note here about Massachusetts where a large section of women were in the labor force devoted to shoe binding. So there are some interesting things that we had never really seen before. And then, of course, we've got all the more detailed statistical information on the states. And once again, New York City is the most populous city um, with 813,000 people. So let's look at a person in the 1860 census that we've looked at before. Colby Ross, we've looked at him in 1840 and 1850. So we're going to look at him again in 1860. So you can see, by tracing one family through as many census records as you can really see what happens to the family over time. So Colby Ross, born in 1813 in North Carolina, his birth year is probably earlier than that, and he dies in January of 1882 in Athens, Limestone, Alabama. Now let's look at his family before we go and look at the census, because there are some changes that come. So for example, Colby Ross's wife, Michael, dies in 1859. And he also loses his son, Thomas Ross, in 1859. His daughter, Cynthia Ann Ross, is married in 1852 and living with her husband. So she's not going to be there in 1860. So that leaves Colby Ross with two of his biological children. And if we scroll down a little bit further on his detail page here, you can see that he marries a woman named Tabitha in January of 1860. So he's remarried by the time the census comes around, which is in June, with Tabitha and her children. So it's a new marriage, a blended family. So let's go look at it in the census and see what we can see. So here he is, Colby Ross, a farmer. He has some land at this point that he says is only worth $80. And it says that his birth location is unknown, which from the 1850 census we know as North Carolina, and later censuses we know as North Carolina. So it's possible that Tabitha was the one that reported the information on the census. So you can see Tabitha Ross here. She says she's 45 and that Colby is 47. But that places Colby Ross, his birth year, too late. So it says it's about 1813. And it's more likely that his birth year is closer to 1806 or so. He should have been in his 50s by this point. And then we have two of Colby Ross's biological children, William Ross and Parthena. William is 19 at this point, and very possible that he joins the American Civil War. Uncertain whether Colby Ross would have joined in fighting, because he would have been in his 50s and a little bit older. But there were men in that age that did fight. So William Ross, 19, possibly goes to war. And then you'll notice that Matilda, Thomas, John, Manalcus, and Michael are all children of Tabitha from a previous marriage. And there's quite an age range there. We have from 21 to 8 years old. So we go from kind of starting to be empty nester to all of a sudden a big family again for Colby Ross. And also, as you're looking at the census, I recommend looking at the neighbors. So on the previous page, there's a family that I showed you in 1850. And it says Garman Gray and Martha Gray family. And that's because Squire, and that's a middle initial of A, marries Matilda Reed, who is Colby Ross's stepdaughter. And so they're just a few households away from Colby Ross in 1860. So let's go forward again. And some of these other families on the surface don't seem like they have any connection or relation to um, Colby Ross, but they were neighbors, and so it may be worth paying attention to see if they're still neighbors in 1870 when we look at the next census. Another thing about the census for 1860 is it does not identify relationships, and so you can kind of infer relationships by looking at the family, but you have to be careful because in some cases they may not be who you think they are. So be careful when you're looking, but you can glean a lot of information from the 1860 census. I hope that was helpful. Thanks for watching.